30 minutes earlier, Victor and the others were sitting, waiting for their turn. Sancho started cracking his fingers, and his eyes began to shine with excitement. He couldn't help but smile since the attack exam was finally about to begin. Next to him sat our boy with crossed arms, who started observing Sancho in silence. Behind him was Piggy, who seemed somewhat confused. Beside them was Sinclair. She extended her hand and realized that Sancho appeared confident about this exam. Sancho began showing a finger and responded with a cheerful smile that the one-on-one duel was a virtue of warriors. He was very enthusiastic and couldn't help but look forward to the start of the exam. Piggy's attention fixed on Sancho, and his eyes widened in surprise, and he casually mentioned that his tutor had said if they didn't use aura in a hand-to-hand combat, the strongest of the ice core was Sancho. Victor began to gaze at the ground, lost in his thoughts. But then, something happened and someone asked Professor Sadi what she was doing. This caught Piggy's attention, leaving him in shock. In front of them was a student and Professor Sadi who was holding a bottle of wine. The boy started staring at her, and upon seeing alcohol, he got angry and with a furious expression full of hatred asked how she could be drinking alcohol during an exam where the students' lives were at stake. Sadi said nothing and remained silent, but the boy mentioned that he could smell the alcohol from afar, and it was evident that she was drunk. Sadi grabbed the bottle of wine and opened her mouth, ready to drink again. In an instant, she drank all the alcohol. According to her, the boy was someone very annoying. She placed her hand on her waist and with a demonic smile began eating the glass bottle in bites as if it were bread. Seeing this, the boy's eyes widened in fear. He took several steps back and couldn't help but panic. The mouth of Professor Sadi was full of pieces of glass. She stuck out her tongue and began to lick the wine that was on her cheek. Then, she wiped her tongue with her hand and started staring intently at the boy with a piercing and evil expression. She made it clear that the alcohol content was only 76 degrees, so it was a bit exaggerated to say it was alcohol. Feeling her expression, Sinclair put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled with fear. Piggy, who was next to her, was open-mouthed, realizing that Professor Sadi was in charge of them, and that she was, just as the rumors said, a strange person. As always, the only one who was calm was Victor, since he had seen people like her many times in his past life. He was somewhat used to this type of person. Sadi took out a sheet, began pointing at the name of one of the students with her finger, and with an excited smile, decided to start the exam. The first student she called was Sancho Barataria. Instead of feeling fear, Sancho grabbed his weapon, and with an excited gaze, stood up and started walking towards Sadi. Sinclair and Victor stood up. Piggy brought his hands to his mouth and started shouting at Sancho to be careful, since there was a rumor that many students who had taken the exam with Professor Sadi could no longer attend the academy. With a confident smile, Sancho asked his friend not to worry about him. Professor Sadi summoned her golem, which appeared in front of her. Sancho approached, began observing the golem, and revealed that the will of a warrior was unbreakable. He gripped his axe tightly and adopted an offensive stance. His eyes were shining with excitement instead of fear. He showed admiration towards her, saying that he was looking forward to her teachings. And then, the exam began. In an instant, Sancho leaped and started descending from the sky toward the golem at great speed, ready to attack. Professor Sadi began to gaze at the ground, and a smile appeared on her face. She stood still for several seconds and then started to show an evil smile, repeating Sancho's words, "The will of a warrior is unbreakable." Sancho attacked with all his strength, but then something happened. Sinclair put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe what her eyes were seeing. Piggy took several steps back. He was in shock and open-mouthed. Victor, who despite being the calmest one, was also in shock. He had never seen anything like it before. The eyes of Sinclair and Piggy were full of confusion, and then they saw something horrible and could not avoid feeling a fear they had never felt before. Once the smoke curtain disappeared, Professor Sadi's golem could be seen standing and holding Sancho, who seemed to be unconscious and covered in blood by the neck. The students were paralyzed with fear. Her golem lifted Sancho by the neck. She couldn't help but feel somewhat disappointed to see that her toy had broken. She was controlling the golem using her hands and with the help of 2 magic circles. Her eyes were shining with malice. She began looking at the other students and, with a smile, asked if this meant that Sancho was disqualified as a warrior. Victor's expression changed drastically. He began to observe Sadi with a serious gaze, not knowing what this girl was plotting. The golem released Sancho's body, causing him to fall on his back against the ground. His friends, who were somewhat worried, ran out to see if he was okay. Victor and Piggy lifted Sancho's body, putting his shoulders on their own shoulders. Piggy asked Sancho to wake up. With an angry expression, Sinclair stood in front, extended her hand to one side, and asked the teacher what she was doing. Her gaze fixed on Sadi, she clenched her fist tightly, questioning how she dared to hit a student until they fainted during an exam. Sadi did not lose her composure and calmly responded that the purpose of this exam was to provide students with real-world experience. She began to raise a finger and with a confident smile made it clear that these were the words of the Academy's first president, asking if she was going to protest in a real fight. Sadi began pointing at Sinclair with her finger, revealing that she was the next to take the exam. She wanted to see the skills of the leader of the Ice Corps. Sinclair's eyes, who had clenched fists, were filled with confusion and fear, not knowing what Sadi was plotting. Just before she could make a decision, someone behind her suggested that she refuse the exam. Upon hearing this, she snapped out of her trance and, somewhat surprised, turned around. Behind her was Victor, who had Sancho's shoulder resting on his own. Our boy's attention was fixed on her. With a sincere gaze he mentioned that Sadi's actions were clearly unfair, and that if she complained to the Academy, it might be possible for her to retake the exam. She began to gaze at the ground with a lost expression and thanked Victor for worrying about her. Her eyes were shining with determination. She swore not to avoid the person who had hurt her friend. A silence took control of the situation. Sadi mocked her by asking why she was making such a pretty face, causing Sinclair's eyes to widen in hatred. She clenched her teeth and couldn't help but feel even angrier. Sadi's gaze fixed on her. With a confident smile, she decided to fix Sinclair's pretty face. The exam began. Sinclair adopted an offensive stance, and with an expression thirsty for revenge, used her power, making several circles appear around her body. She extended her hands toward the sky, and her body began to release a powerful energy. Seeing this, Sadi couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. She was speechless upon seeing that she was capable of using 3 third-class spells at such a young age. For her, this was expected from the next accessit. Her eyes began to shine with malice, and a smile appeared on her face. She controlled her golem, and in an instant, it appeared beneath Sinclair, ready to attack with a powerful punch. Sinclair, who was preparing the attack, started to notice how little by little the golem was approaching and couldn't help but go into shock. Sadi asked if she had ever experienced a mana backlash because her magic was forcibly cancelled. Just before she had time to block the attack, the golem struck forcefully, landing a strong blow to her stomach. The attack was so powerful that the magical circles she had summoned shattered into pieces. There was a backflow of mana in her body, and the mana started to come out of her mouth and eyes, causing her to bleed from the nose, giving her terrible pain. She fell to the ground and placed her hand on her chest. Her entire body was trembling, and she was drooling from the pain. The golem approached her and began observing closely. Sadi asked how it felt, realizing that it hurt much more than Sinclair had thought. Her attention fixed on Sinclair, and an evil smile spread across her face. If she was unlucky, she might not be able to use magic again. For her, it would be fun if the next accessit of the Ice Corps could no longer use magic. The golem gave her a strong kick, making her body roll backward. She had to pray for that not to happen, since after all, she had worked hard to be the next accessit because she was a commoner. Seeing this, Piggy couldn't help but feel somewhat worried about her. He started running toward her to see if she was okay. Our boy began to gaze at her with a serious expression in silence. It was time for the next student to take the exam. It was none other than Piggy, who drew his sword, and despite showing a confident expression, his body was trembling with fear. Piggy grabbed his sword tightly. Sadi put her hand on her waist, extended the other one, and asked who this trash was who didn't even know how to hold a sword. He began to sweat profusely, but even so he did not lose his composure. His eyes were full of determination. He was not a coward, and he was not going to back down. Sadi's golem started walking toward Piggy. This trial was his opportunity to bring to light the courage hidden beneath his weak exterior. Just before Piggy could even prepare his attack, the golem moved quickly and struck with force, breaking the blade of the sword into pieces, making Piggy's eyes widen in surprise. The blade of the sword stuck in the ground several meters back. Piggy was in shock to see that the golem had broken his sword with a simple kick. Piggy's gaze fixed on his broken sword, and he couldn't help but feel fear and confusion. Just before he could understand what had just happened, the golem moved like lightning and gave him a strong kick under the jaw, sending his body flying into the air. While his body was in the air, the golem raised its foot and brought its heel closer to Piggy's head. Sadi mocked him, since no matter how much trash fought, in the end it remained trash. These words made Victor angry, and veins appeared on his face. Piggy's body fell to the ground. Sadi approached and placed her heel on his head, which was full of blood. Seeing that another had fainted, the blonde-haired student couldn't help but be in shock, while on the other side, the black-haired student put his hand on his head. He couldn't believe this was a test. All the students who were going to take the test with Professor Sadi ran toward the door. They started banging on it, but the door didn't open. They wanted to bring another professor here. Piggy's body was lying on the ground, and his head was full of blood. Victor approached and began to observe in silence. Sancho had a black eye, and Sinclair was very injured. The true nature of Victor began to show. He couldn't help but feel furious. Sadi extended her hand toward them, looked away, and with a smile mocked them since this year's students were all cowards. Then she called the next student. But then, something caught her attention, filling her mind with curiosity. Victor, who carried arrows on his back, drew his bow and stood in front of her, indicating that he was ready. He began to look down at the ground, revealing that he was next to take the exam. Upon seeing this, Sadi's eyes widened in surprise. She was happy to see a passionate student. According to her, Victor was very impatient. She was somewhat annoyed since she was about to eat the main course now. Victor stood silently, and the attention of the students who were trying to flee the room focused on him. He was the famous hero of the academy, and rumors said he was a high-ranking sword expert. With an expression thirsty for revenge, Victor grabbed one of the arrows he carried on his back. Professor Sadi was at least a graduate, so there was no way a high-ranking sword expert could defeat her. Besides, bows were the worst weapons to use in a one-on-one fight. The exam began, and Sadi's eyes were full of excitement since crushing talented students was very fun. She controlled her golem, which started to advance quickly toward Victor. He was currently the highest-ranking student in the academy. If she gave a beating to the best student, it would be very pleasurable. Victor, who with one hand was holding the bow, took the arrow he carried on his back with the other and began to observe how little by little the golem was approaching. It started to extend its hand toward him. Sadi wanted to enjoy Victor's cries after breaking his arm. Victor took out an arrow, and just before the golem could get closer, he placed it on the bow, and with an expression full of hatred, prepared to shoot. Then, something happened and Sadi's eyes widened in confusion. Victor shot the arrow at the golem's shoulder, but instead of hitting it, the arrow slipped and changed direction. The arrow was so powerful that it left a deep wound in the golem's body. Our boy began to gaze at Sadi in silence. Her body moved backward. She stopped controlling the golem, causing it to come to a sudden halt just before reaching Victor. The students who were at the door turned around in shock. All of them were open-mouthed upon seeing that he had stopped Sadi's golem. The reality was that the arrow had lodged in Sadi's eye, which was now full of blood. She grabbed the arrow, opened her mouth and began to scream in agony. Due to the intense pain she felt in her eye, she fell to her knees on the ground. Victor released the bowstring and began to enjoy this moment in silence. And so as not to draw attention, he started pretending. With a worried expression, Victor explained that he was trying to shoot at the golem and had no idea how the arrow had reached her. Victor's eyes began to shine with malice, and with an evil smile he asked if Professor Sadi was okay. Sadi put her hand over the eye where she had the arrow stuck, clenched her teeth, and her mind filled with hatred and fury. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.